There's a certain kind of child that the world tends to miss. Not the loud ones, not the ones who raise their hands first, or win the spelling bee, or get their drawing pinned to the front of the classroom. No. The ones the world misses are the quiet ones. The ones who sit near the back. The ones who don't cause trouble, don't demand attention, and somehow, because of that, get none. Jonathan was one of those children. He was 11 years old, and if you had walked into his classroom on any given Tuesday morning, you might not have noticed him at all. He wasn't the smallest kid in the room. He wasn't the biggest either. He just sat there, second row from the back, slightly to the left, doing his work, keeping to himself, and waiting for the day to end. His teachers liked him well enough, but liking someone and believing in them are two very different things. His school reports said things like, "Jonathan is a pleasant student and he tries his best," which sounds kind until you realize what it actually means. It means nobody expected anything from him. Not really. And after years of hearing the same things, Jonathan had quietly stopped expecting anything from himself either. He lived with his mother in a small terraced house in a town that most people outside of it had never heard of. The kind of town where everyone knows each other, but nobody is particularly going anywhere. His mother worked long hours at a factory nearby. She came home tired most nights, cooked something quick, asked about homework, and fell asleep on the sofa before the 10 o'clock news was done. She loved Jonathan deeply. That was never in question. But love, when it's stretched thin by exhaustion and bills and the pressure of doing everything alone, sometimes shows up quietly. She didn't know about the thing inside her son. She had never had the time to find out. And the thing inside Jonathan, it was something else. It started with the old radio in his bedroom. It was a battered little thing, secondhand, with a dial that you had to turn slowly or it would skip past the station. Jonathan would lie on his bed after school and just listen. Pop songs, classical pieces, old hymns that drifted in from a Sunday broadcast. He listened to all of it with the same focused silence that most kids his age gave to video games. But he didn't just listen. Absorber. He would hear a song once, and by the time it finished, something in him had already taken it apart and put it back together. He understood music the way some children understand numbers. Not because anyone taught him, but because it was already inside him, waiting to be used. And then he would sing. Not in front of anyone. Never in front of anyone. He sang in his bedroom with the door shut, or in the bathroom with the tap running so no one could hear, or sometimes just softly to himself while he walked home from school, earphones in, pretending he was listening to something when really he was creating something of his own. His next-door neighbor, a kind older woman who had lived in that row of houses longer than anyone else on the street, heard him once through the wall. She was in her kitchen making tea when the sound came through, faint but clear, and she stopped what she was doing and just stood there. When she saw Jonathan's mother a few days later, she mentioned it, told her that boy of yours has something special. She said it plainly. The way you say something when you mean it. Jonathan's mother smiled and said thank you. But inside, she filed it away under the category of things people say to be kind. She had learned, over the years, not to let herself hope too hard. Jonathan never found out. She'd said it. The weeks passed, the way weeks do, when nothing much is happening. School, home, radio, sleep. Jonathan turned 12, not long after the school year restarted, and nothing changed. He still sat in the second row. His teachers still wrote the same things on his reports. He still ate lunch by himself most days, not because no one wanted to sit with him, but because he had grown comfortable with his own company. And then came Declan. Declan was the kind of boy who filled the room the moment he walked into it loud, confident, always looking for a reaction. He wasn't a bully exactly, but he had that energy that some kids have where everything is a game and somebody always ends up on the losing side without agreeing to play. One afternoon during lunch, Declan was on his phone watching a clip from a talent show. Britain's Got Talent. Some kid had just done something on stage, and the crowd had gone wild. Declan watched it, laughed, and then looked up at the table he was sitting near. Jonathan was there, eating quietly. Declan thought it would be funny. He leaned over and said, loud enough for the kids around to hear, "Oi, Jonathan, you should go on Britain's Got Talent." And then he laughed, and the kids around him laughed too, because that's what you do when Declan laughs. Jonathan looked up. He didn't go red. He didn't look away. He just looked at Declan for a second, then nodded once and said, "All right." The laughter stopped being quite so comfortable after that. Nobody really believed he would do it. It was meant to be a joke, one of those things that gets said and forgotten by the next period. But Jonathan went home that afternoon, found the audition application on the Britain's Got Talent website, and printed it out at the library the following morning before school. He brought it home to his mother that evening and placed it on the kitchen table next to her cup of tea. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she looked at him. He didn't say much, just told her he wanted to try. That was all. She sat with it for a few minutes. Part of her wanted to protect him from the long trip to London, from the cameras, from the possibility of standing in front of strangers and coming home with nothing. She knew how the world treated quiet kids who reached for big things. But there was something in his face that stopped her. A calm. A stillness that didn't look like stubbornness or childish excitement. It looked like certainty. She picked up a pen and started filling out the form. She didn't tell anyone at work. She didn't post about it. She just quietly sent it in and waited. When the confirmation email came back, she read it twice, pressed her lips together, and then went to iron Jonathan's best shirt, the slightly too small blazer he wore on school photo days. Jonathan, for his part, didn't change. He didn't practice in a new way. He didn't suddenly start singing in front of people. He kept doing what he had always done, lying on his bed, listening to his radio, singing to the quiet of his own room, working through songs that a 12-year-old had no business being able to sing, and singing them like he had been born knowing how. The morning they left for London, it was still dark outside. His mother had packed sandwiches in a carrier bag. They took 2 buses and a train. Jonathan sat by the window the whole way, watching the towns thin out and the city grow up around them, his hands flat on his knees, his expression unreadable. When they arrived at the venue and joined the long queue of performers outside, singers, dancers, comedians, acts of every kind, Jonathan looked at all of them and felt nothing close to fear. Felt ready. Not because anyone had told him he was good enough. Not because a teacher had spotted his gift or a coach had trained him or a family friend had put in a good word. But because he had spent years alone in a small bedroom with nothing but a broken radio and something burning quietly inside him. And he had decided that today, finally, it was time to let it out. The backstage area of a live television audition is not a glamorous place. It is all harsh lighting and cold floors and people talking into headsets and not really looking at you. There are nervous performers pacing in small circles. There are parents sitting on plastic chairs, staring at their phones, pretending to be calm. There is the constant low hum of a crowd on the other side of a wall. Thousands of people who have no idea you exist yet. Jonathan stood in the middle of all of it and looked completely His mother stood beside him, her handbag held in front of her with both hands, her eyes moving around the room the way eyes do when a person is trying very hard not to show how anxious they are. She had barely touched her sandwich on the train. She had barely said 10 words since they arrived. She kept looking at Jonathan, checking his face for signs of fear, and kept finding nothing except that same quiet calm that had been there since the morning. A production assistant came by at one point, young woman with a clipboard and a lanyard, and she knelt down slightly to talk to Jonathan the way adults sometimes talk to children, with that overly cheerful voice that means they don't quite know what to say. She asked him if he was nervous. Jonathan thought about it for a second. 10 aside, no. He said he had been doing this his whole life. He just hadn't done it here yet. She laughed a little, wrote something on her clipboard, and moved on. But something in what he said stayed with her. Later, she would tell a colleague about it. She said there was something about the way he said it. Not boastful, not rehearsed, just honest. Like a simple fact. The wait was long. That is the part nobody tells you about. How much of these things is just waiting. Performers around them came and went. Some came back from the stage, grinning. Some came back quiet, already retreating inside themselves. Jonathan watched all of it and said very little. At one point his mother leaned close and asked if he wanted to go through the song one more time in his head. He shook his head. She nodded and went back to holding her handbag. When his name was finally called, something shifted in the air around them. His mother reached out and straightened the collar of his blazer, a small, automatic gesture, the kind mothers make without thinking. Her hands were trembling slightly. Ease, where? nod. He walked toward the stage entrance, and just before the curtain, he paused and turned back to look at her once. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just looked at her. The way you look at someone when you want to remember the moment. And then he turned and walked out. The stage was enormous. Jonathan had seen stages on television before, but standing on one is a completely different thing. The lights hit you first, warm and bright, and oddly disorienting. Then the crowd comes into focus, rows and rows of faces stretching back into the dark, and the sound of 2,000 people shifting and murmuring washes over you like a wave. The judges were seated at a long table to the side. 4 of them, all well-known faces, the kind of people who had sat through hundreds of auditions and carried that fact in the relaxed way they leaned back in their chairs. One of them glanced at Jonathan as he walked to the center of the stage and then looked back down at the papers in front of him. The host welcomed Jonathan with a wide smile and asked the standard questions. Name, age, where he was from. Jonathan answered each one clearly and without fuss. When the host asked what he was going to sing, Jonathan named a song. There was a pause. One of the judges tilted his head. Another raised an eyebrow. The song Jonathan had chosen was not a child's song. It was a big, demanding piece. The kind of song that professional singers approach carefully. The kind that exposes every weakness in a voice if the voice isn't strong enough to hold it. The host asked almost tentatively if he was sure about that one. Jonathan said yes. He said it was the only song he knew completely. There were a few soft laughs in the audience. Not mean ones. Just the quiet, reflexive laughter of people who had already decided what was about to happen and found it slightly endearing that this small, serious boy didn't seem to know it. The music started. For the first few seconds, Jonathan stood completely still with his eyes closed. The crowd settled. Someone near the back coughed. A phone screen lit up briefly somewhere in the middle of the auditorium. And then he sang. The first note came out, and something changed in the room immediately. Not gradually, immediately. The people nearest the front felt it first, and it moved back through the crowd like a current. Heads that had been tilted down came up. Hands that had been scrolling stopped scrolling. People who had been half watching suddenly found themselves watching fully, leaning forward, unsure of what was happening but unable to look away. Jonathan's voice was not what anyone had prepared themselves for. It wasn't a cute child's voice doing something impressive for its age. It was simply a voice, full and clear and completely in control, that happened to belong to a 12-year-old boy standing alone in the middle of a stage in shoes that were slightly too small. There was nothing showy about the way he sang. He wasn't performing for the cameras or playing to the crowd. He was doing exactly what he had always done in his small bedroom. He was just listening to the music inside himself and giving it somewhere to go. The effect on the room was something that is difficult to put into words after the fact, though many people tried. A woman in the third row pressed her hand over her mouth and didn't move it until he finished. A man who had been filming on his phone lowered it slowly to his lap. 2 teenage girls near the side all looked at each other with wide eyes and said nothing. At the judges' table, the shift was visible. One judge had stopped writing entirely and was staring at the stage with an expression that had moved well past surprise. Another had turned slightly in her chair, as if the angle she'd been sitting at was no longer adequate for what she was seeing. The judge, who had barely glanced at Jonathan when he walked out, was now watching him with the focused attention of someone trying to understand something they hadn't expected to need to understand. Backstage, Jonathan's mother had both hands pressed flat against the wall to steady herself. She was not watching through a screen. She was listening, eyes closed, head slightly bowed, tears running down her face without any fuss. She wasn't crying because she was surprised. She was crying because she had always known, somewhere underneath all the exhaustion and the quiet and the years of simply getting through each week, that there was something extraordinary in her son. She had just never heard it fill a room before. When the last note ended, the silence lasted only a few seconds, but they were the kind of seconds that feel much longer. The full, complete silence of a large room where everyone has forgotten, at the same moment, to make any noise at all. Then the crowd came apart. The applause was immediate and total. People were on their feet before it fully registered that the song was over. The sound was enormous, the kind you feel in your chest. All 4 judges stood up. The sharp one, the one with the reputation for saying difficult things plainly and not apologizing for it, stood up first and started clapping before the others. She was the last person in that building anyone would have expected to be the first on her feet. When the noise settled enough for her to speak, she looked at Jonathan for a long moment and said that in all the years she had sat in that chair, she had never felt what she just felt. She said she didn't fully have the words for it. She said she was glad he came. Another judge asked him, who had trained him, who had taught him to do that. Jonathan looked out at the crowd, at all those people still standing, still clapping, still starting, and he said what was simply and completely true. Nobody, he said. I just listened. He got 4 yeses. He walked back off that stage the same way he had walked on quietly, without drama. Shoes slightly too small, blazer slightly too big, but something was different now. The world had heard him, and once the world hears something like that, it does not easily forget. His mother was waiting at the side of the stage. She didn't say anything. She just put her arms around him and held on. And Jonathan, for the first time in a long time, let himself be held. Because the boy nobody had believed in had just walked into a room full of strangers and shown them something real. Not a performance. Not a trick. Just the truth of what had been living inside him all along. Patient and quiet, waiting for its moment. It had found one.